And as Dick said, I'm Eric Pooley, and I am the deputy editor of Business Week. That's not why I'm here today, though. I'm here as the author of a new book called The Climate War. It's a book about the struggle to get serious about climate change in the United States at the federal level. So it's a tale of battling to pass a mandatory declining cap on carbon emissions. In the spring of 2007, I saw that the debate was starting to shift from the science to the politics, from whether climate change is real, although some people still debate that point, it's not really debatable, to what we were going to do about it. And I thought, well, there's a book. How about a book about the attempt to begin to get serious in this country, which is, as you know, has lagged the rest of the industrialized world in taking the problem seriously and beginning to try to address it through a declining cap on emissions. Somewhat naively, I thought that if I tracked this story from 2007 through to 2010, I might be able to tell a story with a happy ending, that I might be able to actually write a narrative, because I wanted to write a political thriller with the fate of the earth hanging in the balance, and that by following the characters at the heart of this debate, by embedding with them, if you will, the way reporters embedded with soldiers in Iraq, but doing it on all sides of the war, that I would be able to tell the story about how we turned the corner and took just the first step to start to get serious about reducing emissions. But a funny thing happened on the way to the signing ceremony. We didn't get serious about it. We didn't pass a federal bill to reduce our emissions. And so the book became not just a political thriller, but actually a murder mystery. It became a whodunit. It became a book about all the forces that conspired to kill climate action on the federal level. And as I was working on it, I thought back a lot of times to when I was a crime reporter in New York in the 1980s. I worked at New York Magazine and I wrote crime stories. And in those days, there was a homicide detective named Marty Davin, who was very famous for showing up at the hospital after someone had been shot on his turf. And he would try to intercept the victim, who would be laying on a gurney out in the hallway. And Davin would go up and lean over the guy and say, "Who killed you?" Which would tend to get the attention of the victim if he was indeed conscious. And he would often protest, "No, I'm not dead yet." And Davin would say, "Well, you're going to die, so you might as well tell me who did it." And as I was working the halls of Congress, interviewing politicians and lobbyists for environmental groups and all the various people that were trying to drive legislation, I often thought of Davin, and I tried to resist for a long time the idea of thinking about this book as a murder mystery, because climate legislation missed a lot of near-death experiences, or survived a lot of near-death experiences in the years I was working on this book. And I had a great deal of respect for the environmentalists I was spending so much time with. And just to lay it down, I spent time and established embargoed reporting relationships with a whole group of people, from Al Gore and the Alliance for Climate Protection to Fred Krupp and the Environmental Defense Fund, to lobbyists like the folks at the American Coalition for Clean Coal Electricity, who are trying to keep the world safe for coal-fired electric generation and trying to essentially stave off climate legislation for as long as possible. A professional climate denier named Myron Ebell from the Competitive Enterprise Institute, Jim Hansen, the climatologist, and a number of other people on various sides of the fight, right down to the activists who are chaining themselves to bulldozers to try to prevent the construction of coal-fired power plants. So I basically was a ping pong for 3 years, bouncing among all these groups as the story unfolded. And then finally this summer, after I'd finished work on the book, I wanted to close it and have it come out in the midst of what I hope would be the next debate, and then write the final chapters for the second edition of the book, or the paperback edition. But this summer, here we are in the hottest summer in recorded history, or at least so far it's shaping up to be that. In the hottest year in recorded history, we've just completed the hottest decade in recorded history, which beat the record set by the previous decade, which beat the record set by the decade before that. We're at a moment where the Russian wheat harvest is being decimated by drought and unprecedented heat. Hundreds of deaths being recorded in Moscow, wildfires. And I thought back to someone who said to me a few years ago, he said, well, when Greenland starts falling into the sea, we'll be ready to get serious about climate change. Well, on August 5th, a chunk of Greenland, 4 times the size of Manhattan, calved off and fell into the sea. Ed Markey, the congressman, said that it's ample room for the professional deniers to set up their own country, and they're now trying to figure out what to call it. But it is, if folks need evidence that this is going on, the evidence is all around us. And yet the United States Senate, just about a week before that huge Greenland ice flow separated from the mainland, announced that it would not be debating comprehensive climate legislation, that it would not be even debating a measly 15% renewable energy standard, which would require utilities to get that percentage of their power from alternative means. And many of you saw in the paper today in the New York Times a great story about renewable electricity in Portugal, which in the last 5 years has moved from 17% to 45% of its electricity from renewable sources. Just one example of what's possible. Now, obviously, the scale in this country is completely different. Much harder for us to scale up as quickly as Portugal is doing. But at the federal level, we're not even trying. I'll talk about things that are going on at the state and local level a little later. But the fact is, across 3 years of repeated attempts, the U.S. Senate has always been a complete obstacle to action in this area. So, as I said, it was a whodunit that I ended up writing. It was a murder mystery, and what I hadn't anticipated was that it would end up being one a lot like Agatha Christie's Murder on the Orient Express, where there are multiple culprits. Everybody is in on the killing. So I thought that I would start by talking a little bit about who some of these culprits are and why it's been so hard for us to achieve any kind of climate action at the federal level. The first group that you have to begin with is the professional deniers. And let me just say, I differentiate between regular folks who are skeptical about climate change and don't know what to believe, and the paid professional public relations executives whose job it has been to spread doubt and confusion about climate change for the last 15 or 20 years. And I mentioned Myron Ebell, one of the people that I look at in the course of the book. These are folks, and I don't claim to have George W. Bush's ability to look into someone's eyes and see down into their soul the way the president famously said he could about Putin. So I don't know, and I'm often asked, do they really believe it? Are they just mercenaries? Ultimately, I don't think it matters, because I've come to the conclusion in more than 25 years of journalism that motive is highly overrated. That ultimately it doesn't really matter why you're doing what you're doing. If what you're doing is bad for the planet, the country, the economy, the future of civilization, the fact that I talked myself into believing it doesn't really, make that much of a difference. So I didn't make any grand attempt to try to figure out if Myron Abel and his ilk believed what they were saying. And I don't spend an enormous amount of time in the book dealing with science. If you're not familiar with climate science and you read The Climate War, you will pick up an awful lot of carefully fact-checked science about exactly what's happening and why. But the thrust of the book is politics and economics. Because what I found with the professional deniers is they were more than happy to fight this war on multiple levels. For people who are still capable of being convinced that the science is not sound and we don't really know what's happening, they will fight it on that level. For other people that are sure that the science is real, and I'm sure all or most of you know, the overwhelming majority of climatologists in this country has no doubt the basics of climate science are fundamentally understood, have been for 100 years, are not in dispute. Of course, there's always debate in any realm of science. Debate never goes away, and I actually think that Al Gore and the environmental community made a strategic error when they announced that the debate was settled and it was time to move on. Because by refusing to engage the deniers, they sort of ceded the messaging space to the professional deniers who filled it up with disinformation. And Gore and the Green Group, which is the sort of loose coalition of major environmental organizations in this country, made a decision to stop arguing about it and say, well, now we have to move on. Well, even though they were right, I think it was the wrong tactic, because you all know what happened. The deniers, along with their enablers in my line of work, the journalists who are scared to come out and say anything without hedging it. So they're always looking for, well, climatologists say this is happening, but I'm going to get the appearance of balance into my story. So I'm going to look for somebody who's saying, well, maybe it's not really happening. And here's Myron Abel or others who share his profession, stepping up and sowing doubt and confusion on what is actually established science. So that's what we call balance bias. That's elevating two sides of an argument even when there aren't two co-equal sides. And that happened with the science for many years until slowly the journalism community began to move on from that false opposition. And then they began to do it with the economics, which was the second great front in the climate war. When the climate deniers saw that people were no longer swayed by disinformation on the science, they began to fill the airwaves with disinformation on economics, and they claimed that any action to stop climate change would destroy the American economy.